Oh, the room mics especially?
Yeah, just the whole thing.
Yeah. All right, so last week Tim took us to the end of chapter 12, Mark chapter 12. So today we're going to start in Mark chapter 13. And we're going to be going through 13 today, or as much as we can, and then we're going to jump somewhere else afterwards. But there's only like a couple chapters left of Mark after this, so we're getting pretty close to the end of this gospel study. It's been really good. All right, so starting in 13 verse 1. So everything that's been happening up to this point, again, we talked about it in John. We're coming back to talk about it more in Mark, but verse 13, or chapter 13, verse 1. As he was going out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." So what are they talking about here? What's the building that they're looking at? Yeah, the temple. So we know in the time of Moses, there was a tabernacle, which is a tent, right? And then after the tent, what was the next construction that was built? Mm-hmm.
The tabernacle in the wilderness?
Yeah, so after the tabernacle in the wilderness, what was built next? Solomon's temple, right? And then what happens to that? Well, because they're not talking about Solomon's temple here. They're talking about something else. But that's why I'm going through it. So Solomon's temple is what? So David saves up the money and the stuff to do it, but God says you can't do it because you have blood on your hands. But his son gets to build it, right? So his son builds it, and then Babylon happens. It's destroyed, and then what happens next?
During Ezra and Nehemiah's time.
Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuild the wall and the temple, right? And then is that what exists in the time of Jesus? No, there's another construction, an expansion, which is Herod's temple, and that's what exists in the time of Jesus. And so there's the tabernacle, there's Solomon, there's the Ezra and Nehemiah version, and then somewhere between those two, Herod's. It's the same stuff, but like instead of one brazen laver, there's like a bunch, and then they have like these small brazen lavers that are on tracks that they roll back and forth because there's just way bigger population. So it's the same elements, but it's like everything's multiplied. There's more golden lampstands. There's windows into the holy place, and so there's storage on the sides and ladders to the second floor, but it's the same principle. But this thing is like massively. If you ever get a chance to do a study, like even see a picture of Solomon's temple next to Herod's, and it pales in comparison. So the Herod's is just massive. Tim?
Wasn't Ezra and Nehemiah's temple, when that was first built, it paled in comparison to Solomon's, right? Wasn't it was smaller? But then the expansion of Herod's is way bigger.
Right. Yeah, and even in the Ezra Nehemiah, for a couple reasons, wasn't great, because even when they finished, no cloud, no fire, and then obviously no ark either. But for Herod's temple now, it's massive and impressive, and it's got like the porch off the side, the Solomon's porch, and the portico, and this area to the side. So like the outer court piece that used to just be the altar and the laver, now it's like, it's almost like a city. So it's got like this is where the priests did this, and this was the representative of this. It was huge, huge. And then there was like an outer court where the people hung out.
Maybe this is like obvious, but it's not obvious to me. So why did Herod come in and like basically just build this massive temple? Like it's not obvious to me. Like I don't really like fully understand it. Was it like a power move? Like does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, some of that historically, it's hard. Who writes history books is those who are in charge of history. And so motivation would be whatever was conveyed, not necessarily what was true. But I think you're probably hitting the nail on the head. I mean, why do you build something huge and beautiful and impressive? But same reason everybody else did.
To like sway the hearts of the people in like a way.
Or to leave a name for yourself. Why you build a pyramid, why you build anything is to be like, under my leadership,
We did these.
we built this huge thing. Yep.
Is it the same Herod, like the killing babies Herod, or is it a different one?
I think it's hard. So some would say that there's more than one that's spoken about, but I think, yes, it's the same one.
It's either him or his son.
Yeah. Hey, Sam. All right, so Jesus is sitting on a hillside with one of the disciples, and the disciple looks at this massive, beautiful temple, all its glory and the light that's there and the beautiful stones and imagery and everything that's used on it, where it's just like this ridiculously impressive construction. And he goes, "Wow, Jesus, that's amazing. Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, like, does anybody else have this experience when talking to Jesus? Look at this thing that I noticed. And Jesus is like, that's what you noticed, huh? So, do you see these great buildings? And the guy's like, well, yeah, because I just said, do you see them? But then he continues, not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Can you imagine looking at something as impressive as that, in magnitude and cost and beauty and pricelessness, that all that exists there, and this is around the year what-ish? 33, somewhere in there, right? What year was this temple destroyed?
40 years later, like
70, yep. So this is true. So if you go to Israel now, what is there that you can pray and put notes in?
the Wailing Wall.
The Wailing Wall. What is the wall?
It's the last standing wall of the temple.
And when archaeologists look at it, what do they find? They rebuilt it. That wasn't the original, like they took stones from it being completely destroyed and they rebuilt it. So that's not even, it's probably the stones that were used, but it's nothing, this was true. Like it was completely demolished.
Every stone, no.
I mean, think about that. When you defeat an enemy, you defeat their enemy and then you keep some of their stuff and you throw some of their stuff away. That's intentionality in that day to dismantle something brick by brick. Yeah. I mean, and even just like the workforce. All right, they're all dead. All right, now let's take their building apart. Well, can we just like use it for storage? Every stone dismantled. Like that's, they went out of their way. And that was part of it, is they want because like Babylon, you read about Babylon in the Old Testament, their walls were so wide and so tall that you could ride chariots around the outside of them. Nothing like that ever existed. Like that was a crazy idea. A wall was just supposed to be thick enough that people couldn't push it over or climb over it easily, or that people could stand on top of it and be like, bad guys over here, to like slow people down. To have your walls so thick that like chariots could ride on them is an insane idea in that day. Like it's over the top. It's like billionaires building rocket ships just to take their friends to space. Like it makes no sense in the commonality of everything else that's going on in the world. There is zero ability to know where Babylon was, because God said it will be completely demolished. So we have ideas of probably where it was in Iraq, but the remnant of those walls that chariots could ride across, nobody knows. So, and again, that's intentionality. And so again, the disciple is impressed with beauty, with construction, with the magnitude of something that's being done. And Jesus is saying, you're impressed by something that will not exist not long from now. Why do you suppose, I mean, before we get any further, what's the point Jesus is making? I mean, I think there's a lot of points being made in this, but I mean, what's some of what we can derive from this, do you think? Jordan. else? Yeah, what's the story right before that we're reading about? The widow's mite.
There's also like a
Because it's sorry, Tim, a value thing. Like they looked at the widow's mite and saw no value. And Jesus is saying heaven saw real value. And he's like, man, this building is huge and expensive and impressive. Like, and Jesus goes, it won't even be there long from now. So the billionaire crafted amazing temple has no lasting value. The fraction of a penny, 2 mites that the widow gave has eternal value. Go ahead, Tim.
just along those same lines. I mean, it's in some ways you see that almost like Ecclesiastes talks about the futility of what man's labor and what man can build, how it in a moment can be torn down. But what God builds is eternal. And I mean, even that, is it in this passage or is it later where he goes on to say, like, destroy this temple and God will raise it up? Like, what God builds, you can't tear down. You can't stop.
3 days later. Yeah.
3 days later, you know, but what man builds in a moment, it can all crumble. And you just got to see that there too. It's going to be torn down.
One of the cool things about learning human history is how many groups of people, how many leaders, how many countries existed that no one could ever imagine them not being the world's most prominent power. And many of those, there's almost no trace of them anymore. But it seems so impressive. And it seems so, I mean, can you imagine living anywhere near this place or this time and hearing that, like, Rome is just a story about hundreds or thousands of years ago? Like, it has zero impact on the world today, except in history. The idea of being Roman, it's not the same thing, but similar to, like, if you're an American in another country that relies on America for foreign aid and, like, you get into trouble, you can get away with stuff that other people can't get away with because of where your citizenship lies. That existed there. I mean, there's parts where Paul talks about it. Hey, look, I'm a Roman citizen. And everyone who hated him and wanted to kill him, they're like, oh, my bad. Like, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that you were. So Rome didn't just have an impressive army. Rome didn't just have, like, authority and military power. Even the citizens of Rome were, like, honored, revered, and feared everywhere they went because of Rome's power. What power does Rome have now? It is a historic site. Their economy struggles. They rely 100% on tourism to come in and look at buildings that are barely standing, and that's what they thrive on. That idea was impossible to believe at this time. And yet, they were so impressed. And so today, what's our hope in? Why are we going to be safe? Why do we have nothing to worry about? What's going to sustain us? If we're looking at things that aren't Him, it could be dust way faster than we think. Pretty crazy to think about. So this disciple just points out, and maybe innocently, like, I was just trying to say it was a cool building, Jesus. Why you got to turn everything around like this? But I get it. Oh my gosh. Can't we just have a nice picnic on a hill? So do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. I was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? So his disciples, those close to him, they're hanging out with him, they're having this conversation. They believe him. I mean, his disciples believe. Okay, so Like, when's that going to happen? Like, that seems crazy, but when's that going to happen? And what's going to lead up to that moment so that we can kind of see it coming? Reasonable question, yeah? And Jesus began to say to them, see to it that no one misleads you. Now, this is the piece that I feel like is so important through all of Mark 13, but really a lot of these passages that Jesus speaks about. Because this is going to talk about near future shaking of the world as they know it, the destruction of Jerusalem and the persecution and all these things and wars and rumors of wars we're going to be reading about. But it's also talking about, and it kind of slips in and out of future someday, and it also talks about like when Jesus returns, the tribulation and when Jesus returns. And so there's a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to determine which ones are which ones are both, and which ones are only this. And so Mark 13 is a strongly debated chapter in Scripture of what does it mean, what does it stand for, what is it about. But I love that it begins with, what are you looking at? Because I feel like that same lesson carries us through Mark 13. Because what's the first thing that he says in his response? See to it that no one mislead you. He's going to say a lot of things like this. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will mislead many. So they're asking about when will this temple fall? When will there be a destruction here? And how will we see it coming? And Jesus says, be careful not to be misled. Now, who knows Jesus better than the disciples? Who knows Jesus better than these disciples who are spending this time with him? No one. Don't be misled. People will come saying they're coming on behalf of me or that they are me. Don't be misled by them. Doesn't that seem kind of crazy? Like, I say to you guys, hey, I hope you have a good summer, but just so you know, if someone who looks like me or sounds like me says they're me, be careful, don't be tricked, it's not really me. You'd be like, okay, like how would that even be possible? Like, what a weird thing to warn me of, right? But, again, we know the rest of the New Testament, and we certainly know history after that. How many people were misled by false Christs? How much of the church today is following a false gospel? And so, this happened. It seems crazy, but this happened. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. So it's not saying there'll be some weirdos and that'll be crazy. It's saying there's going to be people who claim to be me, and many people will believe them and follow them in another way. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, again, see to it no one misleads you, do not be frightened. Don't be misled. Don't be afraid. So what is he speaking to? Is he talking about what to do to prevent the circumstances, or how to live in the midst of the circumstances? How to live in the midst of it, right? So that's going to happen. Don't be misled by it. That's going to happen. Don't be afraid in the middle of it. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. I feel like sometimes our prayers, our ideas, or our beliefs about Jesus is always like so that the circumstances that affect us externally not happen. And I feel like so much of Scripture, and certainly so much of what Jesus says to his disciples, is make us into what you've called and created us to be, so that in the midst of those circumstances, your message, your way, your heart will be shared. I'm not saying we can't pray against bad things happening, but if all we do is pray against bad things happening, I think we're missing what we see so clearly here in Mark 13. And again, so this is one of those contested chapters. It's something that a lot of people are like, this is end times, this isn't end times, that's the same as Daniel, this is not the same as Daniel, the book of Daniel. And so, But there's such a message to the church for in the midst of these things. Now we know, again, historically, how did the disciples do as all these things happened in their lives? Awesome. What was their life like after Christ came, rose from the dead, Pentecost happens, the church expanded wildly, and the disciples went to the edges of the earth, right? And then what was their end? They were all killed. And refused to go against what Christ had said, refused to renounce him, refused to stop telling people about him, refused to stop sharing the gospel, even unto death. So if you're being killed for the gospel, what's happening in the culture that you're in for people to be so upset that they're killing you? Is it going the right way or the wrong way? We want our external circumstances to change to make it so we don't have to feel challenged. Like somehow that's the only way that God can work. And sometimes God's saying, ask that I strengthen you, because that's what's happening in the world. And here he says what? Those things must take place.
And like I feel like so often, like especially with our culture, like we've been given so much freedom and so much like benefit and like privilege that we don't think that suffering is our lot in life, And I don't know, I think in like so many ways, like we call like little things suffering, and yet I read about like churches all throughout history who were horribly persecuted, and they rejoiced in their suffering and actually found joy. And like isn't James where it says like count it joy when you face trials and sufferings of many kinds?
It calls us to be like, oh, I'm being persecuted for Jesus. How cool is this?
And like even in Acts 3 where the disciples get like what is it, Peter and John who get like beaten? Like,
They're praising in jail.
and they're,
Bless the Lord, oh my soul. Yeah.
they come back to their people and they're like, we just got beat for Jesus.
Yeah.
They're like so stoked about it.
And if you keep doing it, we're gonna beat you again. They said they're gonna beat us again, but let me tell you about Jesus. Like, it's like blood is coming out of their nose and their ears on sideways, and like, yeah.
I just think it's an invitation for us to ask to see
Yes.
even clearly,
Yeah.
even more clearly. As we've read the Gospels, that's all that like I'm really captivated by is that the whole thing is an invitation to see Him like rightly. And if our focus is our comfort, if our focus is to not receive refinement because like it's uncomfortable, that we feel that friction like happening in us, then may we see rightly. May we ask God to remove those things that we would rather like edify and protect ourselves than receive the fullness that He has to offer.
Yeah.
Because I always hear it's like, well, why would God want me to suffer? It's like, I think you have to adjust even your question. Like, why would He want you to suffer? Why would He want you to live with such darkness and such like selfishness that He wouldn't want to refine these things out of you to be more purified, to be a better image of Him? It's not that He wants you to suffer, but He wants a better and fuller picture of you.
Or even to step back from our own person and say, why would it be so important to Him for the gospel to go forth, even if it causes suffering to those who are sharing it?
Yeah.
Because the gospel is that big of a deal. Yeah.
It's not willing,
Right.
like, to just be like a full representation of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. The guys selling themselves into slavery so that they could preach the gospel to slaves. I mean, well, why would God want you to do that? Because the gospel, like.
Saint Augustine, he has a quote. He says, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church."
Yeah.
And it's such an challenging quote, but you really see that when the church is persecuted and going through that, the gospel seems to go forth with amazing vigor and zeal and power. It wasn't persecution that killed the church. It was oftentimes prosperity. It was when they became comfortable. And not that God's against prosperity. It doesn't have to kill the church. He loves to bless His children. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You see blessing all through the Bible. But
and I think that the pendulum can go both ways, like
Yes.
where God speaks through pain. So if you're not experiencing pain, God's not speaking to you. Well, that's not true.
Correct.
God speaks through blessing. So if you're not experiencing blessing, then you're not in God's will.
Also.
That's not true.
Right.
And God doesn't call you to do things unless, it's just terrifying and horrifying to do it. Well, that's not true, but he could.
Right.
He doesn't call you to do things unless it just fills you with joy. Like, well, he could, but that's not. And I think when we try to make a rule out of these things, and I think the point that you got to, Anya, of it's not about like, I'm happy that you're suffering. There's a mission, and even in the suffering of the mission, there's a producing in you that even that you'll be thankful for. Even in that crushing, on the other side, you'd be like, wow, I mean, you waste nothing, God. Even in that, like, I see your goodness.
That builds your faith and
Yeah.
your trust in him.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah. So again, he's speaking to your perspective, your wisdom, your attitude, your, like, where's your hope in? Because again, if we're not misled, how do we prevent from being misled? How do we prevent ourselves from being misled? If I don't want to be led by the spirit of the world, how do I guarantee that I'm not? Say it louder, Andrew. Be led by the Spirit. Because if I'm being led by nothing, then anything can grab my attention and I'll follow it. If I'm being led by my preferences, then a spirit other than Christ can woo me through my preferences and pull me in a direction I'm not supposed to be. But if every day, every moment, my life is a spirit-led life, where it is my intention to lean into what the Spirit of God is doing and saying and calling me into, then when some other spirit comes along and says, you should go this way, it's like, no. I'm clearly being led. So if we don't want to be misled, we need to be following. So again, if we just view the Spirit of God and our faith and our walk with Jesus as a moral idea that we follow, of a basic idea of how we approach decisions and what kind of people we associate ourselves with, man, we're easy pickings. But if you're Spirit-led, and if that's the priority and the focus of our life, then there's security, there's peace, there's joy, there's hope, there's life in that. And in the same way, don't be afraid. How is it that we can not be afraid? In Him. You can, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, your way right into a fire, not staring at the fire because you know who the one that's with you. And so it doesn't mean all our circumstances will be such that there's no room for us to be afraid. It's that we're so sure, we're seeing Him so clearly that how can I be afraid? How can I be afraid if Thou art with me? And so, again, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be afraid. Those things must take place, but that is not the end yet. For nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So, for those of you who have had kids and for those of you who will have kids in the future, when you have your first kid especially, you're going to have this moment where you're sure it's time to have a baby. And so you go to the hospital and you tell the doctor, I am here to have my baby. And you are experiencing pains like you cannot imagine. And they told you the things to watch for, and you've watched for them, and you're there, and you're like, it is time. And that terrible, horrible doctor will look you in the eyes and say, you're not even close, you can go home. And you'll think all sorts of horrible things about him, because certainly it could not be more than this. These pains that you feel of your body preparing to give birth are signs that it is coming, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's time. Did I do an okay job representing that from one who's never actually given birth? Is that okay? I was just there when it happened. I didn't. But yes, I mean, that's
That's what it seems.
based on the fingerprints that were left in my arm as she let go. I feel pretty confident that, yeah, right? So, That's not the end. It says those are just birth pangs.
He
Sam,
wants
you-
validation.
yeah, I saw that. On you.
This is making me nervous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be awesome. You don't even know. But then what does he tell us in verse 9? But be on your guard. Don't be misled. Don't be afraid. Be on your guard. For they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them. Now listen. He says, be on your guard what? To escape? Be on your guard to, find a secret way out of discomfort or persecution? He's saying, don't be misled by false Christs. Don't be afraid when things are not going well, and be on your guard. Because why? You're going to get arrested, and you're going to get beat. You're going to get beat badly in front of groups of people for sport, so people can cheer on as you're beat. And the people who sit on the high stages and the high platforms watching for their own entertainment, for you to get beat, for my name, is for what purpose? It says right at the end. Why? Why did all this happen? A testimony for who? The people who are beating you and arresting you and putting you in that place. Not only is he saying you won't be apart from this kind of suffering, that your suffering will be for the sake of testimony for those who are causing you to suffer. Who else did that? Can you think of anybody? Do you know anybody who was beaten and crucified for the sake of others, and while they're on the cross, they say things like, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing? To the thief on the cross next to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. He's literally telling them, you'll get to do what I'm fixing to do. And it's not so that you prove to me that you meant it. It's not to inspire the church behind you that they can do it too. It's for the testimony of what I've done in your life and who I am to those who would see you in these positions, in these places. That just seems unreasonable, right? Why? Verse 10. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. Why? Why does all of this, why is not being misled so important? Why is not being afraid so important? Why is being on our guard so important? Because the gospel has to go out. The gospel has to go out everywhere. And then that pesky first word of verse 11. When, if only it were if, when they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you're to say. If I'm being arrested and beaten, what am I worrying about? Gosh, what am I going to say? I don't think that's what I'm worried about, right? I'm worried about I'm being arrested and beaten. But if I'm here, and if I'm getting this, and if I'm understanding this, and if I'm walking in this, it's all right, I'm about to be on stage. I'm about to be beat in front of a group of people that hate Jesus, and I'm being beaten because of my faith and my belief in Him. I hope I don't miss my window. I hope I don't fail to say what I'm called to say in this moment. He says, don't be afraid right there. Don't be afraid that you won't have the words. Don't be afraid that you won't say what you're supposed to say in those moments. Don't be afraid or worry beforehand about what you're supposed to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. That verses 5 through 11 don't fit in most of our paradigms as people for what a church is and what a Christian is. But there it is all the same. We call it persecution if we get the small house instead of the big house. We get a new car, but it's kind of an off-brand. Someone at the church was mean. Like you said, Anya, like we call stuff persecution. That's not persecution. And I can't help but wonder if the persecution that we call persecution, that is in fact not persecution, if we can't make it through that, why does it matter? Are we somehow proving our faith in Jesus by enduring to the end? Does it matter because we're proving that our commitment was big? See, that's what Peter said before the cross. Not me, God, I wouldn't deny you. What is he saying? Like, I'm super committed. I love you. I know you, Jesus. I wouldn't betray you. I will put everything I got into supporting you and follow. I will cut an ear off. I'm not even scared. I will. But then what does he do in his own strength? He fails. He denies Jesus to a little girl. 3 times. But, I mean, to like the easiest person to not deny Jesus to, he denies Jesus to. And the cross comes and the resurrection comes. And then Peter finds himself in the reality of this conversation he has with Jesus. And through church history, we know that Peter was going to be crucified. And he pleaded and said, no, you can't crucify. I'm not worthy to die like my Jesus. He doesn't say, don't crucify me. I don't want to die. He says, I'm not worthy to die like he died. So they crucify him upside down. And he dies glad. Not worrying about what? Whether or not he's arrested or crucified? No. But that he wouldn't say what he's supposed to say. And Jesus says, it's not about your strength. It's not about you proving something. It's not about you showing how strong you are. It's that in that place, in that moment, around those people, the Holy Spirit will speak through you when you've got your stage. That's a different kind of message. I mean, I in no way am trying to preach this at someone else, for someone else. I'm speaking this to myself. But I ask that you ask the question too, Lord, where have I gotten stuck? Because I've called stuff persecution that wasn't, and I've allowed challenge or struggles to be a wall instead of a doorway? And where have I called difficulty your lack of goodness rather than seeing it for the stage that it is to proclaim what you're saying? Brother will betray brother to death. A father, his child. And children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. There'll be so much deception. There'll be so much fear. There'll be so much that family will turn against family to save their own neck. Verse 13, you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Don't be misled. Don't be afraid. Be on your guard. And don't worry about what to say in those moments. That's the message. Everything else is just the circumstances. And that message works through all of time, through every culture, through every circumstance, through every thing that we've been called to. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt when brother betrays brother. Doesn't mean it's not awful. Doesn't mean it's not fun to be treated badly because you're doing something that God had asked you to do. Just means it's not weird. It's not like not part of the deal. You'll be hated. Any thoughts? Anything anybody wants to share? There's a pretty hard turn at verse 14, so I don't want to move on from this unless... Amen. And it starts with, isn't that man-made thing so impressive? Daily.
People being saved every day. And we were talking yesterday, like, what would that be like in our lives? Like, and my heart was cut. Like, I'm so concerned with like getting my rest and like doing the things that like fill me and feed me and make sure my marriage is like good. And those things aren't bad. You know what I mean? Those are things are all really important. But like, just even culturally, like we're so like inwardly focused, like, and we're so yielded to the ways like of our culture in the world. And I've just been so like cut by that. And of course, like there's room for rest, and there's room for like, you know, building and edifying my marriage, and like, you know,
Okay.
prioritizing friendship and all of those things. Those are all really good things, but if it's not all submitted to the Lord and His ways, like it's wrong.
Yeah.
Like it looks like a good thing, masquerading and just like parading around like it is good, but if it's not all submitted to Him, it's just not. Like it's gonna come to nothing, and it's gonna come to frustration at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I just think this is just like another illustration of that in a different way.
It's so good
So
on
I
you.
just feel really cut in like the best way.
Yeah, me too.
If that makes sense.
I think for me too that like so much of like 16 to 30 of my life was learning what really mattered and what really didn't.
Yeah.
And you know, Teresa and I have said a long time ago, we really believe our job as parents is to teach our kids to hear and to obey the voice of God. And I have to be honest, as you know, Isaiah's graduated and moving into adulthood, and Priscilla's right there. Like, my prayer for them is that they would just follow what Jesus is saying. But there's also a part of me that wrestles with, but I want them to focus on the things that I knew when I was their age that took years for me to unlearn. It's like, it's about following Jesus, but also, you know, follow your dreams and make your life comfortable. And it's like, why would I give advice that took years for me to, I'm still, unlearning. And it's amazing how with one breath or one side of our mouth we can truly believe, but then we're just so ingrained, I guess, to your point about culture.
Yeah.
Like, what do I really deserve? What do I really need? What do I really, and
And it's hard when people like around you are like if I'm like, what do I do with like this money? My dad's like, you should invest it into like a Roth IRA so that you have retirement. And I was like, oh, I guess I should plan for retirement. And then it's like this whole mind shift about like how to invest in this like earthly plan for my life when I don't even know that I believe fully in retirement. Like, not that like, you know what I mean, but like that my work is never done. Like, I don't really want to move forward in that mindset, but it's like you hear so many different opinions and perspectives that are people who love the Lord and yet mixed with really earthly things, and then what that produces is something impure and very mixed. And so then you have to sift through like, well, what's the Lord? What's wisdom? And I just don't.
because does the Bible say save? Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah,
And does the Bible say you're trusting in your savings and your life ends tonight?
yeah,
It says that too.
yeah.
So what's the plan?
Right.
Is it submit to this is what the culture says maturity is, or is it be spirit led?
Right. And I don't want my words for people
Right.
that I share to be mixed.
Right.
I want them to just be saturated with heaven.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to speak with worry or fear or doubt of what's to come. I just want to be so fixed on Him that, like, everything that comes out is fixed on
Yeah.
Him.
Amen on you.
It just sounds so simple, and yet, like, then I find myself, like, doing something, and I'm like, crap. Dang it.
Yeah. Hey Lord, so I'm here again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts to share? Pretty cool, pretty convicting. I mean, at least for me, but I mean, it's awesome too. Like, how many times do you read a passage like, don't worry? And you're like, yeah, you shouldn't worry in those moments. You're right, God, thank you. But he's like, no, don't worry about what you'll say. Like that is what was in their heart when they're being persecuted and beaten. Man, God, I really hope I say what I'm supposed to right now. What? I mean, again, let's take it from that to this week. When Andrew says something that drives me crazy. Not that he ever could or would, of course, because he's delightful in every way, but like if that were a thing, or if Andrew points out something that I'm doing wrong or that I've done that has made something difficult for someone else, do I think about like, who are you to say something to me? What about my place or my role? What about how you're supposed to honor or respect me, or how, like, what I know versus what you know, or all these things that the world might say? What if my approach to life were such that, Lord, when those challenges come up, man, I know I shouldn't worry, but I really want to say what I'm supposed to say that honors you and helps them in that moment. Like, isn't that a switch? Like, isn't that I think, I don't remember the wording you used, Anya, but almost like the self-preservation thing.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that having healthy relationships and letting people say whatever to you without saying, the Bible doesn't teach that. But in those moments of challenge, like, what's my aim really? And I feel like the church is a training ground. And if I can't get that right, like if I can't respond with the heart of Christ in that moment, how in the heck am I going to do that in the world when they don't care about me? So is this about history? Is this about future? Is this about end times? Is this about today? Yep. I think that's a good place to stop for today. Any other thoughts anybody wants to share before we wrap it up?